So first of all, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
For sure. How in detail do you want me to go? 1 minute or 5 minutes?
Just casual, whatever you want.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for the invite. Appreciate being invited on to speak today. So my name's James Morehen, and I'm a performance nutritionist working in professional sport. Currently work as a lead nutritionist at Bristol Bears rugby. So that's a rugby union team in the southwest of England. And then I've also got the contract with England Rugby supporting the women's program there with the England Rugby Roses. And then outside of that, I also have my own business. I've got my kind of own mentorship program with young nutritionists and kind of junior nutritionists. And then I've got a couple of combat sport athletes, professional boxers that I look after as well. So that's me currently right now. And prior to that, my journey leading into that was an undergraduate degree at Liverpool John Moores University in sport and exercise science. I then progressed on to the masters in sports physiology, again at Liverpool John Moores. And then after that, went into my PhD in what was probably sport nutrition and applied physiology with body composition change as well. And again, that was at LJMU. So kind of that was my journey in my academic career, really.
So you're currently like Pete Burridge's colleague right now?
Yeah, I am. I work with Pete every single week. Yeah, he's a really good man, good bloke, and a great practitioner as well, actually. Yeah,
Nice.
you know Pete then?
Yeah, I talked to him like a few times before.
Class. Nice.
Cool. So the first thing I want to ask is like, why is nutrition so important for athletes?
Yeah, good global question. So, look, of course, I'm biased. I'm a nutritionist, and I work with athletes in this domain. But I genuinely believe nutrition is one of those areas of sports science that on the day of competition or the day of a tournament can genuinely impact the outcome of that performance. So, if you've got a athlete for whatever reason that has got severe gut problems and their stomach's turned upside down and they're on the toilet before the game or before the match, then you're not going to get the best performance out of that athlete. Likewise, if you've got an athlete that hasn't followed an optimal fueling plan in terms of muscle glycogen, skeletal muscle glycogen, then you're not going to get the best performance out of them for 80 or 90 minutes, or whether it's, a 5-set tennis game. So in terms of nutrition and performance, it's imperative that they get that right. Where I educate some of the rugby boys and girls now is how nutrition can impact a lot more than just that performance on the day of the game, but also training adaptation that they're trying to go through week to week in terms of hypertrophy, strength, power, speed. Me and Pete quite often talk about the best speed coach is a nutritionist, because if I can take a little bit of weight off of that individual and they keep their force and power, then they're going to carry that momentum. And then alongside that, you've got body composition change, athlete health, travel nutrition, immunity. So kind of the list goes on really in terms of how important nutrition is for the athlete in terms of their development, adaptation, and performance.
Cool. So since we brought up Pete and he's a great speed coach, how exactly is nutrition gonna help athletes gonna like if they want to get faster?
Yeah, so we quite often talk about players presenting themselves as functional as they can. So what I mean by functional is, let's say we've got a 100 kilo rugby player, and through body composition assessment or visually looking at that player, as a staffing group, we would see that they're probably carrying a little bit of excess fat mass, which is not ideal for their position. If I can then take 2 kilos of fat mass off of that individual nutritionally from better behavior change, better habits, and they keep their skeletal muscle mass, and therefore they keep their strength, their power, their force, then just by the law of physics, if we've got 2 kilo less weight to carry, then that individual should have a better 10 meter, 40 meter sprinting time. So in terms of how can nutrition help an athlete get quicker, I guess the short answer would be to make them more functional as a runner from a weight and a body mass point of view. And that's where we can redefine what that body composition is and that functionality of the athlete.
I love this. So since if we want to like make our athlete run faster, losing some of their like weight is probably going to be easier. So there's going to be times that athlete wants to lose weight, but they probably lose the weight like too quickly, or they're probably just stuck in the weight, they can't lose weight. So is there a certain way to like successfully lose their weight and being safely?
Yeah, well, I think every athlete has a different starting position. Everyone weighs a different body mass, and they will all have different levels of fat mass on that individual kind of body. So the starting position is always different. If you've got a larger athlete who's got 25 kilos of fat mass, then we've got a lot that we can play with straight away. And what you might see is that if that individual follows, for once in their career, they follow a good nutrition plan, they stay on track, their behavior changes a lot better around nutrition, and they've got better habits. What you might see actually is that you've got an individual there that's got no problem losing 1 kilo of fat mass a month, or maybe even more. They might start dropping close to 1 kilos over 7 or 10 days in terms of fat mass because they've got it to lose. So the opposite end of the scale is that if you've got a lighter athlete that actually is already quite lean, but we identify that there's potentially maybe a kilo of fat mass that could come off, then I would look at that individual and say, look, we're just going to do this slowly over the next 4 weeks. We're going to chip away at it very gradually. We're going to bring you into a calorie deficit ever so slightly. And I just want to see that scale dropping down gradually over the next 4 weeks. And let's have a look whether that then correlates with the fact that you're becoming quicker and your momentum and your ability to generate that speed over 10 and 40 meters is improving. And if so, then we've got a great outcome to that project. And we are now at Bristol Bears, we're kind of tracking those metrics. So body composition assessment with me and body mass is now tracked alongside counter movement jump, sprint scores, speed scores, force scores. So it's not just an isolated body composition measurement. It's now directly reported back to the player in terms of a performance metric. So that's kind of the I guess the differences in terms of the amount of weight that might be lost depending on where the starting point is with the athlete.
Cool. So when athletes, especially like athletes in rugby or like football, that kind of sports, when they like lose amount of weight, there's probably gonna be in danger to like some hamstring pull or some muscle injury. So when losing weight, how exactly can we like prevent these kinds of injury?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a nutrition point of view, it's just being smart and strategic about and realistic about the amount of weight that we're trying to lose over what period of time. So, I mean, I'm fortunate to have worked with some brilliant combat sport athletes and boxers, and these guys have got no problems losing 10 kilos in 10 weeks. I've worked with athletes that have lost 17 kilos in 11 weeks with their acute weight loss. So an amazing amount of weight, but I'd never dream of doing that with the rugby players. I think the most weight that I've seen lost over a period of time might be 4 or 5 kilos. And in terms of how do you try and prevent the injury occurring from that, I think it's very difficult to do that to try and match up the nutritional relationship, weight loss, and then potential injury risk. I'm not aware of any kind of literature or research that's looked at that specifically to try and answer that question. But the one thing that we would encourage the athletes to do is to not do it quickly and to yo-yo around these big weight changes, but to look at it as a gradual progress or a gradual increase or decrease in body mass.
Yeah, cool. So, uh, when like working with pro athletes, it's pretty important for them to like be able to like have their like protein like every day. So they probably should have like twice their body weight of like kilogram of protein every day, right? Or twice or more. So how do you like divide it into like different meals? Like how many should they be eating per meal?
Yeah, so for us working with professional rugby players, we would encourage our athletes to work on a bit of a bandwidth of 1.6 grams per kilo up to about 2.2 gram per kilo of body mass. Sometimes that might be higher, 2.5, maybe 3 in certain situations. But Professor Stu Phillips, one of the world leaders in this area, would say minimum athletes need to be at 1.6. So that's kind of our bandwidth that we work towards. Where it might be different in terms of that upper threshold is recently we had a complete kind of hamstring rupture at Bristol Bears, and this individual went in for surgery. And my advice to him was, look, coming out of surgery, it's really important that protein goes through the roof. The reason for that is because one, I want to try and maintain all of the skeletal muscle mass you've got, and we don't want you to lose weight. And secondly, it's really important that we try and support that repair and that recovery, considering that you've just been cut open and sewn back together by a surgeon in hospital. So I had him at between 2.5 and 3 gram per kilo of protein over the course of the day. And then coming back to your question there around how do you consume that and how does it work? Well, we try and break that down over regular time points throughout the day. So I encourage the athletes that when they're awake, every 2 to 3 hours, they will be consuming some form of protein to make sure that they're having this protein pulsing through the day. And so that allows them to reach their total target over the course of the day. And what we educate the athletes on is essentially the 3 T's of nutrition. So that's timing, which comes back to the protein pulsing every 2 to 3 hours. It's the total amount. So I'm advising the athletes to consume between 30 and 40 grams of protein every time. And then it's the type of protein. So where possible, if they're a meat eater and they're happy to have whey proteins, then that's the sort of protein that I'd be encouraging through the day from food and supplements. And then before bed, preferably I'd like a casein style protein, which is a slow release, and that will allow that absorption and digestion kind of through their sleep time. So the 3 T's of nutrition is something that we would encourage them to follow quite closely.
So there's always discussion about like the best timing for like athletes to consume protein is probably after a hard session of workout or a hard game match. I saw on your screen that there's a post discussing about like should we be consuming before the warm up or sorry before the session or after the session?
In terms of protein content?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this is where kind of to coin Lauren Bannock's term in terms of context, one of the things we have to think about is what is the context of the training day and the situation. So if at the club that I work at, we can provide breakfast to the players and then they go straight into a field session, then in my opinion, they don't need to have breakfast and then a shake and then the field, because they would have had around 40 to 50 grams of protein at breakfast from food. So I'm quite happy that amount of protein and the requirement of protein has been ticked before the session. And then following the session, if the lads are going straight into the gym, then we might encourage them to have a protein shake. So they're kind of recovering from the field session, and then they've got a little bit of protein within the body before they're lifting weights. And then after that, we would go upstairs and we would have lunch. So again, we would be getting it from our food type anyway. So it kind of depends on what that day looks like. If you've got an individual that, for whatever reason, is not training until 1 p.m. in the afternoon and they've had a lay-in, then, my encouragement would be to say, well, look, we need to have some protein now as a brunch. And then it probably would help you if you had a supplement or an extra protein intake before the training session. Otherwise, you might struggle to reach that total amount over the course of the day because you've kind of had a lay-in and you've slept and you've missed that first window of opportunity to consume protein. So I don't think we need to be as strict as the moment they drop a dumbbell, they must neck a shake. I don't think we need to be doing that anymore. But there's just an awareness piece of trying to get in the total amount of protein over that course of the day is going to be key.
So that's discussion for like protein. How about the role for carbohydrate? Why is this so important for like athlete to recover?
Yeah, well, I think that hopefully the majority of nutritionists now working in sport, especially team sport and endurance sport, would agree that, carbohydrate and therefore skeletal muscle glycogen is really the main driver for high intensity exercise and performance. And what we know from some of the work that I've been part of at Liverpool John Moores University, where we've actually done muscle biopsy studies in professional rugby players, and we've looked at the impact of consuming a 6 gram per kilo carbohydrate load into the game versus a 3 gram per kilo carbohydrate load into the game. And what we're finding is that those players that consume the lower ends, so the 3 gram per kilo of carbohydrate, tend to run out of skeletal muscle glycogen far quicker than the guys that had double the amount and the 6 gram per kilo. So what we're seeing in rugby is that there's a clear requirement for rugby players to utilize and use muscle glycogen during match play. And if you go in at the lower end of 3 gram per kilo, then you might run the risk of maybe premature fatigue in that second half, which is exactly where we don't want to be fatiguing in match play. So carbohydrate is king for us in terms of team sport, allowing those players to really fuel up, make sure they've got a maximal reservoir of skeletal muscle glycogen to go and perform, and also then to recover. So we know that, again, from some of the work that we've done at John Moores University, that if you can ensure your athletes have an immediate load of carbohydrate in that first 4-hour window post-game, then we're going to see a much better uptake of glycogen back into the muscle versus a delayed refeeding strategy. So the player that doesn't want to eat after the game because he doesn't want to, goes to bed, doesn't have any carbohydrates, and then wakes up in the morning, that player is going to be in a far worse position from skeletal muscle resynthesis of glycogen. So yeah, I think, look, from my point of view, glycogen is key. Carbohydrate is key for these team sport athletes, and it really does drive winning performances.
So is there like, let's say if they like eat like bread or like noodles, does that make any difference?
Well, I think the strategy that we would follow is encouraging the players on the day before a game to be consuming a mixed GI, a mixed glycemic index of carbohydrates. So enjoying the fact that you've got different options from low GI to high GI carbohydrates and implementing that on that match day -1. So that can be the difference of porridge oats in the morning to maybe white bread with a little bit of jam or honey before they go to bed to increase the carb content there. And then all of the different GI of carbs throughout the day. So there is a difference. Kind of, it does make a difference in terms of what you're consuming, but the day before, in my view, it should be a mixed GI of carbohydrates. And then there's an argument to say the day of the game, depending on what time that kickoff is, you might want to opt for higher GI carbohydrates to get that glycogen and the glucose in the blood and muscle respectively a little bit quicker. But, remembering that the day of the game, really, that's all about topping up skeletal muscle glycogen a little bit, but mainly topping up that liver glycogen that we may have used or lost overnight.
So when it comes to like training session, like speed training or like a heavy gym session, is it
Yeah.
kind of the same principle with like like you mentioned, the day before and the day after, probably it's like the meal before or the meal after. Is it the same principle?
Yeah, exactly that. So what you're talking about now is what we kind of look at in terms of nutritional periodization and in particular carbohydrate periodization and fueling for the work required. And then I take that a step further to get my players to think about eating with intent. So I'll give you a good example. If tomorrow me and you are going to meet in the morning at 10 a.m. and we're going to go and do a conditioning session, and the outcome of that conditioning session is that we want to improve body composition, maybe drop a little bit of fat mass if we can, but it's really not about hitting the high intensity outcomes that we want. Then there's an argument to say that me and you really should have a high protein, low carb breakfast, because the purpose of that session, the intent of that session is that we're trying to drive a little bit of fat oxidation. The opposite of that is to say that if I'm in the gym and Pete's session is all about strength and power, then I would encourage my players to consume carbohydrates at breakfast, because I know that Pete's doing a strength power session with you. And what he wants is you to be fueled and ready for that training session, not to be going into it feeling tired, fatigued, and without any energy in the body. So when we talk about nutrition and we look at the amount of times that performance nutrition can impact the player over the course of a single day, and then over the course of a week and a month and a year, I genuinely believe the players that understand that are the ones that really go on and develop, because they're using every meal as an opportunity to develop or change their body in whatever way they're trying to achieve, whether that's an increase in mitochondrial efficiency, whether that's an increase in skeletal muscle mass, whether that's a decrease in fat mass, or actually whether it's they're a little bit under the weather and they've got an opportunity to try and improve their immunity and their kind of immune function.
So can you dive a little bit deeper into like the nutrition and periodization and the carb periodization?
Yeah, so I mean, like I was saying there, if I've got players that are training in the morning and they've got a big strength lifting session in the morning, and the rest of the day they don't have anything training wise, then I would encourage them to have a high carbohydrate, high protein breakfast, so that they're getting that fuel in and they've got the protein in before their lift. They then do their strength and their big lifting session in the gym. And then I would probably encourage them to then have a moderate carbohydrate, high protein lunch, so that they're kind of refueling a little bit and recovering from that session with a lot of protein, loads of salad, loads of vegetables. And then the mid-afternoon snack, in my opinion, should be high protein. And then in that evening period, if all they're doing is going home, putting their feet up and resting, then I think it should be a low to moderate carbohydrate meal. I don't think they need a high carb meal at 7 o'clock at night when they're not doing anything, when they're relaxing. So they would opt for a low to moderate carbohydrate meal, lots of protein, loads of color, fruits and salads and vegetables, and then ideally a protein-based option before they go to sleep. What I see too many times is that every single meal is carbohydrate heavy. And then what we result in is an individual that's over consuming carbohydrates. They're not using that energy, and then they store it as fat mass.
Cool. So, uh, so is there a like, or how exactly do like carbohydrate work with protein? Is there like certain like ratio? How should they be taking per meal?
Yeah, so the work from Stu Phillips and his lab is looking at around 0.3 gram per kilo of protein per body mass. So let's keep it simple. If you've got a 100 kilo rugby player, then ideally they should be having servings of around 30 grams of protein. Now, we actually think that should probably be a bit higher with rugby players. So we encourage them to go at an amount or a ratio of a 0.4 gram per kilo. So about 40 grams for a 100 kilo rugby player per serving. Now, the carbohydrate content is broken down over the course of the day. So if I'm saying that I want you to consume 3 gram per kilo over the course of the day, and you're 100 kilo, that's 300 grams of carbohydrate. Then it's about breaking that down over the different meals and being specific about what meal is going to be really high in carbohydrate and what meal is going to be low in carbohydrate, so that we're now periodizing that carbohydrate nutrition and really eating with intent with each specific meal, and not just sitting down and eating the meal for no reason. There's a reason that you're eating that meal. Is it because you want to replenish glycogen into the muscle, or is it because you want to stay low carb and you want lots of protein because you're about to go to bed?
So since we're talking about like periodization, is in season nutrition and off season nutrition that if let's say if it's the same player, is their nutrition strategy going to change?
100% it should. No day is exactly the same. I'll give you a good analogy. So if you're going to get in your car and drive 10 miles and your car is empty, you're only going to put a little bit of petrol in the car because you're only going 10 miles. But if you're going to get in your car and your car's empty and you're traveling 250 miles, you need to probably put a full tank of petrol in your car, because you've got two different journeys. You've got two different demands on the car in that particular situation. And what you've just highlighted there is a perfect example of where you have an athlete with different demands placed on the body. If we've got an athlete that is in season and they're training 4 times a week and they're playing 1 game a week, then that individual needs to periodize their carbohydrates day to day, meal to meal, in line with when that game is. If you've got an athlete in their off season and they're about to go to Las Vegas and have a week's holiday, in my opinion, they don't need the same amount of carbohydrates that they do when they're in season as a professional athlete. And if they're going to sit down, they're going to be on the sun lounger, they're going to rest and relax. If they want to stay on top of body composition, then they cannot consume the same amount of carbohydrate that they do when they're in season prepping and playing for match play. Of course, they still want to consume carbohydrates, but they need to be smart and specific about how much do I need to consume, considering the different demands of my day. And we know this from the research. There's lots of studies now that are looking at the energy expenditure of professional athletes, from Everton Academy players to the rugby players that I've worked with. I did a recent study with the England women's football team, the Lionesses, and looked at their energy expenditure. And we're beginning to understand now that different days result in the different amount of energy expenditure experienced. And so there really shouldn't be 2 days that are the same over the course of a 7-day window.
Cool. So I know the next one's gonna be a little bit hard, but can you like give us an example, like exactly like how many grams of like protein and carbohydrates should they be taking during the off season, and how many grams of like carbohydrate and protein should they be, let's say, consuming on a gaming day? And it's gonna be difficult. Sorry.
Yeah, so we'll keep it simple. On a match day -1, the day before a game, for me, rugby players and football players or soccer players should be consuming minimum of 6 grams per kilo of carbohydrate, maybe up to 8 grams per kilo of carbohydrate in that 24, 36 hours leading into the game. Now, there's going to be quite a substantial amount of calories there coming from carbohydrate. And so the focus really shouldn't be on protein on the day before a game. It should be all on carbs. So you might drop protein intake down to 1.2 grams per kilo or maybe 1.5. And then normally you find that fat seems to hover around 1 gram per kilo. But we should have a real big dominance on carbohydrates, a little bit of protein, and then a smaller amount of fat. Now, in the off season, if it's not the day before a game and all they're doing today is going to the park with their daughter and they're going to go for a coffee with their wife, then in my opinion, they should reframe that and they should pull carbohydrate down, maybe to 1 or 2 grams per kilos or 2.5 grams per kilos of carbohydrate. And then they should ramp up the protein content to make sure that they're still eating a good amount of calories that day. But now we're starting to get a lot more of those calories from protein content to look after the muscle mass and not have an over-reliance on carbohydrates. So it's a real sliding scale. And the way that I like to share, or the way that I think about it with the athletes I work with is it's almost like a DJ on the decks. So we've kind of got bass and we've got acoustic, and the DJ has to slide that depending on what the music is. So my athlete looking at his day, he needs to say, right, well, on this day, I need more carbohydrate and less protein. And that's how I'm going to play my music that day. That's how I'm going to do my nutrition strategy. But on Tuesday, it's the day before a game. So I need more carbohydrate and I need less protein. And that's how I'm going to play the music that day. And that's how I kind of try and get them to think about it. That it's a sliding scale that changes every single day.
Cool. So you mentioned the match day before the game. Yeah, the match minus 1 day, right? The game day
Yeah.
before. So what about the game day and the game day after?
Yeah. So on game day, my advice would be to be consuming between 1 to 3 grams per kilo of carbohydrate. And what I'm beginning to learn from the athletes is that more athletes are beginning to lean towards consuming that carbohydrate from liquid. So they don't like to feel too heavy going into the game, and they'd prefer actually to maybe drink their carbohydrate so that they can get it in through fluids, which is absolutely fine because there's plenty of ways to do that. So you have to make sure that the day before is done correct. And then depending on when your kickoff is, you can kind of, again, consume between that 1 to 3 grams per kilo of carbohydrate and play around with the fact that you can get that from liquid food as well and liquid carbohydrates. Now, once the game's finished, again, depending on when that kickoff and the end of the game is, you then have either a large window of opportunity to recover or a small window of opportunity, depending on the end of the game and kind of how close that is to bedtime. But in any sense, in that recovery window post game, I would be encouraging the athletes to consume 1 gram per kilo of carbohydrate for the first 4 hours after that match. So if you're a 100 kilo rugby player, ideally we want 100 grams of carbohydrates every hour for the first 4 hours, which is 400 grams. That's going to help with that muscle glycogen replenishment. And we know from literature that if we add creatine into that recovery shake, then we're going to get that glycogen back into the muscle a little bit quicker as well. And protein content, again, I'd be encouraging that athlete to consume a recovery protein shake or food as quick as we can, and then following that protein pulsing before they go to bed, and almost a non-negotiable that there's a protein-based option before they go to sleep. On the recovery day, this is where it can change a lot for athletes depending whether they've laid in, what time they're waking up in the morning. But kind of a non-negotiable that we're following at the moment is that they eat like a king on that recovery day. That breakfast meal should be a really good carb-dense, high-protein-dense meal with lots of calories and ideally lots of foods from the polyphenol family and antioxidants to help with that muscle recovery.
Great. So, besides like protein and carbohydrate, is there like any supplement we should probably be noticing?
Yeah, in my landscape right now with rugby players, I think to help them consume their total amount of protein over the course of the day, it's whey protein, it's casein protein. But following food first and trying to get it in, but not food only. Creatine is a wonderful supplement with kind of a plethora of research behind it. So again, a creatine supplement 3 to 5 grams per day would be ideal for a rugby player. And then I think you've got things like in the winter months here now in the Northern Hemisphere, stuff like vitamin D3, which is going to be important for that immunity health as they go through the winter months. So, for me, they would be 3 that I would encourage any rugby player or any team sport athlete to be consuming, all which have got really good, robust research behind it.
Cool. Last question before I let you go, okay?
Yeah.
So, uh, I noticed that there's probably some athletes like to drink like sports drinks, right? So do you or your organization like use sports drink with your athlete?
Yeah, we do. We use sports drinks on definitely on a match day, sometimes on a match day -1. And the reason we use it on a match day is it provides an opportunity for the player to consume 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrates leading or before the game. And also during the game, they can then top up on that carbohydrate content. And certainly although it's not hot now, but in the hot weather, then it provides an opportunity for that player to increase their fluid intake. And normally the majority of these drinks also contain electrolytes and some key salts that will support a little bit of hydration as well.
So if I want to make my own like sport drink, how can I make my own sports drinks?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways you could do it, really. If you were to get a glass of water with some cordial, some Ribena, orange squash, whatever it might be, and add in a little bit of salt into that drink. Not an amazing amount of salt, but just a couple of kind of pinches of salt in there, and you won't be far off a small sports drink there. Now, you're not going to have the carbohydrate content of these sports drinks that are manufactured, but you would have a carbohydrate content within there. It wouldn't be anywhere near to the other drinks, but that could be your own little sports drink. Or if the reason for creating your own sports drink is because you want the carbohydrate content, then you could consider something like a glass of apple juice, orange juice, or a chocolate flavored milk, which would have 30 grams of carbohydrates in it, no problem.
Cool. That's kind of all the question I have for today. So
No.
if there's like coaches, therapists, or like athletes are interested in what we are talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at morehen performance. I'm also on LinkedIn, so people can search my name, James Morehen, and also on Twitter as well. And I've got my website, and yeah, a quick Google search, and I think people would pick me up. And happy to chat and yeah, reach out to anyone.
So where can they find your mentorship?
Yeah, the mentorship, I can share you a link, and by all means, you could put that out. But if they were just to Google Morehen Performance Mentorship, that would come up. And we've got a great cohort of students going through that now, which is really fun and interesting. And then I've also got my book that I published on Amazon about 18 months ago, The Performance Nutritionist. So if people want to learn around how 10 other practitioners have gone through their own career, what they've done, what they've learned, and how they got their job, then that would be a really good read for anyone that's interested in learning about how other nutritionists have navigated their own career.
Cool, man. Appreciate it.
No problems at all. Thanks for the invite.
No worries.